So welcome to our annual Marvin and Caroline Birger lecture, which is made possible by the generosity of the Birger family. My name is Enrico Spolaore. I'm the chair of the economics department, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce today's distinguished speaker. Lawrence Katz is the Elisabeth Allison Professor of Economics at Harvard, and is also a research associate of the NBR, where he's affiliated with at least 5 different programs, I think. And he also served as chief economist at the US Department of Labor in the 1990s, and he's definitely one of the world's leading experts in labor economics, and he has also done a lot of work in the growing field of social economics and the economics of social problems. So he has contributed to our understanding of very important and policy-relevant issues, wage inequality trends, the impact of globalization and technological change on the labor market, the economics of immigration, unemployment, regional labor markets, the evaluation of labor market programs, social and economic consequences of the birth control pill, and the topic of today, the impact of neighborhood poverty on low-income families. He's also the author with Claudia Goldin of a great book that I strongly recommend, The Race Between Education and Technology. That's a history of US economic inequality, and it really looks at the role of both technological change and the pace of educational advance in affecting especially the wage structure. So in particular, and this is what today's lecture is about, is Professor Katz is the principal investigator in an important long-term evaluation of the Moving to Opportunity program, which is a randomized housing mobility experiment. And today, Professor Katz will talk about this fascinating work, which is, the title of his lecture is, Do Neighborhoods Matter for Disadvantaged Families? The Long-Term Impacts of Moving to Opportunity. So we'll have Professor Katz's lecture, then there will be an opportunity for questions and answers from the audience, and then there is a reception afterwards, at least I hope. I don't know, I haven't seen the food, but I'm told that there is some food and drink afterwards, and that would be another opportunity for some of you if you want to talk to Professor Katz. And so join me in welcoming and thanking you, Professor Larry Katz, for this Birger lecture. Thanks.
Okay, well, I'm delighted to be able to be here today and to speak. And as Enrico says, I'm going to be reporting on a long-term project, looking at one of the longest outstanding questions in the social sciences, which is how do neighborhood environments affect social outcomes, health outcomes, economic outcomes, educational outcomes, and there is serious research dating back to the to the 17th century in which social observers have documented strong correlations between neighborhood environments and criminal involvement, health outcomes, economic outcomes, and there are huge swaths of social science literature, very serious work about models of why people follow what their neighbors do, how opportunities will differ by where you live and who you interact with, as well as mechanisms involving things like exposure to air pollution and to stress and safety. And basically what I'm going to talk about today is an attempt not to necessarily identify all the mechanisms, but to truly get experimental variation in neighborhood environments and actually ask what is the direct causal effect of neighborhood environments on social outcomes, and to follow it for a long period of time. We've been following this social experiment now for 15 years. And in doing so, this is sort of been a large collaborative project. And before going into the lecture, I just need to make acknowledgments to, as you can see, there was a big team of individuals involved here. In particular, Jens Ludwig at the University of Chicago has really been key in this long-term evaluation and played a leading role in all the papers. And Lisa Sanbun-Matsu, who was a Kennedy School PhD, who works at the NBR, has managed all the day-to-day operations operations and collecting, 11,000 observations, cleaning the data, and doing more administrative data collection, because in the United States, every single state has a different administrative data system. So if you want to learn about criminal behavior and arrest, you have to gather data from every state the families lived in, as well as from adult criminal justice, juvenile criminal justice, their unemployment insurance systems, the welfare system. So it was a very large project, and a number of other very distinguished social scientists have played key roles in different parts of this project. Greg Duncan at UC Irvine has played a central role in the education parts, Lisa Janetian in the employment parts, Ron Kessler from Harvard Medical School on mental health, and Jeff Kling, who was a student of mine, who now is the deputy director of the Congressional Budget Office, has been here from the start in every aspect of MTO. And because none of us economists are serious experts on physical health, we had a team of health experts helping us collect biomarkers to measure things, such as diabetes and stress and other areas. So it's a large team effort. And while this project was actually set up by Congress in 1992 in an urban bill in a brief period after the Rodney King Los Angeles riots that some of you may be old enough to have remembered, there was a brief period of interest in urban policy, and money was given to the Department of Housing and Urban Development for innovative policies to deal with inner city problems. And out of that came this randomized experiment, Moving to Opportunity. But if you actually look at the money allocated by the legislation and provided by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, we would have been able to sample basically 1/10 of the sample and collected no administrative data and not found it, not actually track the kids. So most of the resources for this came from a consortium of many years of working to get funding to track the 5,000 families and over 11,000 people involved in this housing mobility experiment. So there is a wide range of funders that have provided support, and of course none of them are responsible for any of the findings, although they may be responsible for why some things were emphasized more than others, because if the National Institute of Mental Health is providing you with funding, you better believe you'll ask a lot of questions on the mental health side, which we wanted to do, but clearly there was some impact there. So what I want to do today is do a little bit of a general overview on why we might think neighborhood environments may have a causal effect, and why we may worry that the nature of the fact that individuals aren't necessarily randomly allocated neighborhoods may mean that what look like strong correlations may just be picking up the characteristics that are difficult to measure of families that end up in living in different types of environments, as opposed to the effects of those neighborhood environments themselves. I'll talk about the Moving to Opportunity experiment. Then I will show you that there actually is an experiment that offering and helping families move out of the highest poverty areas of the United States, large cities, they actually could find housing and persist for some period in very different neighborhoods. This is really going to be a test of a couple of things. The first, is it actually possible with the value of housing vouchers in the United States to move into very different neighborhoods? And then what are actually the effects of doing it? We'll talk about this is largely going to be a sample that started out as the people living in distressed inner city public housing in the United States, which are largely single female-headed households with children. So we'll look at the adult household head outcomes, which are largely women's outcomes, and then the youth and children's outcomes. And finally, I'll try to summarize at least one. We'll have a lot of wide range of results with some ambiguous findings, and so I'll let the final word be the self-assessments of the families themselves, their own sort of views of their subjective well-being, as at least an indicator on was this a win or was it a loss as a policy, and we'll talk more about the scientific lessons. Okay, so some motivation. Basically, anyway, if you look in any U.S. city, you will see that people are not randomly allocated across neighborhoods. There is tons of ethnic and racial residential segregation. The typical African American family lives in a very different neighborhood than the typical white family. Typical recent immigrant family lives in a very different one. There are extremely high levels of residential racial segregation in the U.S. It's been going down over time over the last 4 decades, but it still is quite extreme. On top of racial residential segregation, there is large and growing income segregation. That is, if you look at the likelihood, if you're a poor family in the bottom fifth of the income distribution, that you live with families, say, in the middle or the upper side, that has been declining over time, and it's particularly been declining for minority households. So this is a recent attempt by Sean Reardon at Stanford and Case Bischoff to have a fairly uniform measure over time across the censuses from 70, 80, 90, 2000, and 2010 of the degree to which people of different incomes live in different neighborhoods. And as you can see, for black families, this is sort of a summary measure, while racial segregation has been declining, the opening up of suburbs to middle-class households, growing problems in inner city has meant more than a doubling of a sort of pretty reasonable measure of income segregation. And there's also been large increases for Hispanic families and overall. So in the US in recent decades, racial segregation is high but declining. Income segregation is growing substantially, and one interesting thing we're going to look at in this experiment is in the different cities, the moves of the families will have different changes in sort of how concentrated the poverty of their areas are versus how racially integrated they are, and we have enough ability to sort of try to sort out, because it's income segregation is really what's been growing in recent decades. So one motivation is there is growing economic segregation of residential environments in the US. And the other is that when you look in any longitudinal sample and you look where kids grew up and then follow them later in life, and any cross-section sample, you look where people live and what happens to their economic outcomes. This doesn't mean these are causal statements. There is very strong correlational evidence that growing up in a poor neighborhood is associated with far more social problems than growing up in a middle class or affluent neighborhood, and that adults in such neighborhoods have much more difficulty in the labor market, have many more health problems, they are much more likely to be victims of crime, and have a lot more mental health problems as well. Of course, it shouldn't be surprising that the adults do, since we live in an economy where largely people are getting their housing based on their economic ability to pay. So what's causing what is quite difficult here, and the types of families living in very poor neighborhoods are going to be quite different from those growing up in more affluent. Even when we control for the education of parents, for how much income they have in our best measures, one still has to ask, why do two families, one choose to sacrifice to live in a very different neighborhood than another, and is the neighborhood the reason for the difference, or is it the things we find difficult to measure about families? And if you look at sort of non-experimental studies, basically you end up playing something we call name that residual, which is the more stuff you control for, the smaller it looks like the effects of neighborhoods. On the other hand, you can argue that you're over-controlling. Maybe the parent's economic situation itself was a function of neighborhood environment, and you can also argue that you're incredibly under-controlling. If we see 1 year's income, we're not measuring permanent differences across families. If we see very noisy measures of their educational attainment and quality of schooling, maybe we're really missing out. So without some sort of natural or actual experiment, it's going to be very difficult to sort out these very strong correlations in the data, whether they are picking up what we call selection or whether they're picking up causal effects. Why might we think there would be causal effects of the neighborhood environments? Well, for hundreds of years, people have speculated and shown a lot of evidence for different mechanisms. There is the physical environment itself. If you look at and I'll show some photos, what the housing conditions and what the neighborhoods look like of the people in this, starting in this experiment, they are in very, much of the original rationale for public housing policies had to do with physical environments and slums, and the view that they were areas with lots of disease would spread, that the physical environment itself led to social problems, as in what are now called modern epidemic theories. There the epidemics were actually transmitted in sort of germ theory, and that's been translated into social behavior. So you might imagine air quality, being in a high dense urban area is associated with much more air pollution. Before the de-leading of gasoline, that's actually associated with a very strong adverse health impacts, physical safety. lot of work. Many people here have done very important work on the role of social networks for finding a job, for getting connected in education. Who your neighbors are could be quite important. The community resources, access to health care, the types of schools you go to, as well as a wide range of role models from adults and children, all may be important mechanisms and or mediators we've tried to collect information on. And so all those things most people think suggest that a better neighborhood in terms of its economic and safety characteristics ought to be associated with better outcomes. But you can certainly tell stories for why you would find no effects, that even in a very dangerous environment, people can protect their kids. People can find, even in any school, there are all sorts of different groups that you could have as your peers. Maybe the average peer environment isn't that important. Individuals have enough ability to choose who their friends are. And you can even tell stories in the opposite direction. Maybe taking poor families and moving them to wealthier neighborhoods or schools actually could backfire. If social rewards depend on your relative status and you have less resources from your family, maybe it even does worse for you. Think about policies where it's your rank in school that might matter whether you get into college rather than your absolute performance. So there are relative deprivation. Maybe your choices. If you move to a neighborhood where you're very low down on the academic preparation list, but pretty high up on sort of the, being cool and the ability to sort of be tough in the street, you may behave very differently. And so there are reasons to think that, it's not so clear what the direction of the actual effects are. So what we're going to try to do is try to at least look for a very important group of individuals we think at what having the opportunity to move to very different types of neighborhoods does over 10 to 15 years. And so what I'm going to talk about is known as the Moving to Opportunity Demonstration Project. As I noted, it was established in the Housing and Community Development Act of 1992. It is a true randomized social experiment. Basically, it was open to families with children, which are largely single female-headed families, who are living in the highest poverty neighborhoods and public housing units in 5 U.S. cities: Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York. So you had to live in a census tract, which is an area of about 1,500 people, that had an over 40% poverty rate in the 1990 census. So that is, in the upper sort of 3 to 4% of the, poorest neighborhoods in the United States. So the upper 3 or 4% of the poverty distribution, or the bottom 5% of median family income distribution. So these are very extreme poverty areas. Currently, about 10 million Americans live in such neighborhoods with over 40% poverty rates. And you had to be living in public housing or project-based assisted housing. So think of the Robert Taylor homes, think about Cabrini Green, think about in Boston some areas in Roxbury, Dorchester, public housing units in those areas would be the eligible parts. Many of those public housing units, particularly in Chicago and Baltimore, have actually been demolished, not something anticipated when this experiment started out. So the control group is going to end up also moving for the most part because we greatly changed policy. There are 5 sites. Basically, we solicited, marketed in these public housing units in the mid-1990s, offering people basically the opportunity to turn their public housing into a housing voucher to move out in the private market and have more choice in housing. In most of these cities, there was about a 5 to 8 year wait to get a what then was called a Section 8 voucher, today called a housing choice voucher. So who are the families that we're going to be looking at? They are families in very poor neighborhoods who are living in public housing who wanted to move, who wanted the opportunity to get out. If they could get a housing voucher, they volunteered. And among those groups, there, so they aren't people who were very satisfied with their housing to start, and they had to be people who were sufficiently had their acts together that they paid attention to like what was on the bulletin board and what they got in their mail, and they could show up and fill out a survey at baseline. So about a third of the households in these, who were eligible actually signed up, over time for this program. And then this is basically in Chicago. an example of what you should think of as what is the housing unit on the outside and sort of the inside where they were living. They're highly, in Chicago and Baltimore, something like 97 to 99% African American, and the other cities more mixed between Hispanic and African American. These were high-rise public housing projects built in the 40s and 50s in very bad condition. In most of these places, and this unit, as in many of them, has been demolished since the mid-1990s when that photo was taken. So what happened if you signed up for this program and filled in a detailed baseline survey is there then was a lottery, and basically the control group continued to receive their project-based assistance. There were 2 treatment groups, and they had 2 different aims. One of them, what we call the Section 8 group, received standard Section 8 vouchers, no additional help moving, an unrestricted Section 8 voucher. What that means, unrestricted, is that it had the normal rules of Section 8, which means you can only use it to move to a housing unit that pays basically at up to the sort of 40th to 45th percentile, depending on the city, rent in the city. It's sort of set a fair housing rent, and it has to pass inspection. And so a first question is how easy is it? And you only have, depending on the city, 4 to 6 months to use your voucher and find such. So it's not, even when you're given a voucher, it's not clear you're necessarily going to find housing if in your New York City and you only have 4 months to find it in a tight housing market in the mid-1990s, for example. So that's one treatment group, and the goal there is to look at an actual policy in place, the choice between, sort of public housing and Section 8 vouchers. The other was more of an attempt, not necessarily that we would set up an actual policy that said you could only move to an area with an under 10% poverty rate, but to try to get really large changes in neighborhood environments and use this as a mechanism for really learning about something we don't see very often in the actual data, which is families moving to quite different types of neighborhoods. So the experimental group got a Section 8 voucher, the same economic value as a standard one, but they could only move to an area that had an under 10% poverty rate, below the US national average as of the 1990 census, so middle class neighborhoods. And we didn't think they would have that great a chance without some help in finding it, so we also provided them with some counseling, largely by local nonprofits who are housing mobility groups. So the very simple economics of what you might think of just in none of the more interesting things about what does this do to health or psychology or employment opportunities. Imagine we're just changing the budget set of these individuals. Yeah, Mike.
Did any of the people who were offered the experiment turn it down?
What we will look at is something called lease up, and I will get there. In the experimental group, leasing up or compliance means basically about half, 47% of the people offered a voucher, used it, and found a qualifying unit in under 10% poverty area within the 4 to 6 months that they were given. Of the remaining 53%, there are multiple reasons why they were non-compliers. One reason is they really wanted to be in the program, they tried really hard, and they were in New York City in 1996, and it was really tough to find a qualified housing unit, and they just failed. Another reason is they said they wanted to be in the program, they got, they entered it 2 months later, we offered them a voucher, they had a new boyfriend and no longer wanted to move, their life had changed, so some of it is, that, and some of it, is basically, that it's really tough to find housing. So we can't, we have some qualitative interviews on why they didn't move. We think most of it was trying and not being able to.
So
and
this difference here is basically because it was so much harder to find
qualified housing.
housing.
So even though
Less than 10% poverty.
right, so we gave them help. So the Section 8 people didn't have any
Even
help.
with help.
Right, even with help. So in fact, this is much higher than our housing people thought would actually happen, and this basically talks about the motivation of these families. We ex ante were given the people at HUD and the people in the local housing authorities thought maybe a third of the experimental group would actually be able to lease up, was their view, and their view was maybe 50% of the Section 8 group. And nationally, if you look, unrestricted Section 8 vouchers, you will often find groups in some cities where only a third, 40% lease up. So these are not out of whack. with, even people who've been on waiting lists for years have a tough time finding housing in these
So it's a
cities.
weird experiment when you only think a third of the people are gonna be able to take up the treatment in a way.
Well, that's, the sample sizes were set, so the question, the sample sizes that so there's a larger experimental group than Section 8 group that was set up, basically on our belief that we would have a lower take-up rate and we would need, so there was some attempt, to think through what sort of sample size for a given effect you would need given the anticipated lease-up rates, yes.
So clearly this group is no longer random though in any.
Oh, yeah, so, no, what you would never do, and we will see, you never take the people who actually leased up and compare them to the control group. We will go through basically what we're going to do. There are two estimators we're going to look at here. They're known.
Biased and one's not biased.
Right. Well, one is, the intent to treat estimator, which I think is the clean thing you get out of the experiment, which basically is we just compare everyone who was eligible. Everyone who got randomized into experimental or Section 8, we compare with the control group for their outcomes. To the extent that this truly was a lottery and every evidence we have, it really was random assignment. This is, the only reason up to sampling error, there ought to be differences between people randomized to experimental and others is the opportunity to move. A stronger set of assumptions are needed to blow that up to the effect of actually moving through the program, and that's what's known as the treatment on treated or TOTE estimate. And that is not done by taking the actual movers and comparing the control group. We keep all the people, the movers and the non-movers, and we compare them to the control group, but essentially we inflate that intent to treat estimate by the fraction that moves. So we take the ITT and you multiply it by 2.1 for the experimental, and you take it and multiply it by 1.6 for the Section 8, and under the essentially several assumptions. One assumption, which is that there really was random assignment, which you need for ITT. The second is that being offered a voucher only affects your outcome. This is the more difficult one if you actually use the voucher. That, 15 years, if 15 years ago someone offered you a voucher and you never used it, we don't think, whether you are more obese or less obese today really has anything to do with that event 15 years ago. That's probably not literally true, because it could be that you actually searched for housing, you failed, but it changed your attitude towards searching for housing, and maybe you moved 2 years later rather than 3 years later on the other. But that's one way. And the third one is that there are what are known as there are no crossovers. That's, if you define the treatment as moving with a moving to opportunity voucher, that's by definition true. If you want to turn this into the overall effect of using a voucher, it becomes much more mushy because huge numbers of the control families end up getting Section 8 vouchers when their housing units are demolished, 5 years and 10 years later. And so this experiment over the long run is going to be about getting an early opportunity to move and getting some help and move versus sort of being kicked out of your public housing 10 or 15 years later is essentially what the control group's going to have happen to them. Okay, so back to the simple economics before going on to the more. So imagine that, the one way to interpret what this experiment did, so think of this as your simplest model of a consumer choice. The consumer can choose something we'll call housing and neighborhood amenities, and they can choose all other consumption goods. And think of some budget set. And basically one way to interpret this program in terms of just the simple consumption and welfare is public housing forces you to sort of live in a very, high concentration, low quality housing relative to your optimal choice given a given budget set in order to get that. So you're sort of at that point over there. If we give you free choice, of how much housing and neighborhood amenities to choose, you're going to choose your optimal bundle, and Section 8 should sort of be free choice. The experimental one, we sort of force you to use up, in the simple interpretation to get a better neighborhood. And so you end up there. Presumably if you moved, if I drew an indifference curve, this one would have to be higher than that one because no one would choose to move with the experimental voucher if they were forced there and didn't. That would be one way of interpreting. That's probably not the right way to think of what this did. Probably a more reasonable way to think of it, and what the data actually suggests, is that in fact the way this works, if you kept your income constant, you basically you have the same spending the same amount on housing, but you're getting much more out of it. Because basically you spend 30% of your income, the way the budget works in a Section 8 program, you now can get better housing and you still just spend 30% of your income, and now you even get a better neighborhood and spend only 30% of your income. This one, depending on what you think of those attributes, could be in there or out there, but there are reasons to think this should just, purely on a consumption basis make you better off, because we're basically giving you the opportunity to get better housing and neighborhood amenities and leaving you with the same after-tax income, even if you change no other behavior. So this should be a sort of windfall, and if you think about the economics, in some sense this is an income effect, so the pure simplest economics, if you weren't changing people's labor market opportunities, you'd actually expect a negative effect on labor supply, because we've effectively raised your sort of income and you'd have a standard income effect. Of course, there are many reasons to think we've also moved you to areas that might have better job opportunities, and that would have a positive effect. There's actually some research that one of my collaborators, Jens Ludwig, has done, in which you look at people who get vouchers who were not in public housing to start, but living in apartments where they don't move, they just now get a subsidy. And you do find the adverse labor supply effects then, because it's basically just giving you more income, you get the housing for cheaper. So when we're going to find very little economic effect, it could be this mix of better opportunities with this sort of income effect on labor supply, or it may be just that the spatial dimension isn't very important for such disadvantaged families and their labor market outcomes. So there are reasons to think it should raise the well-being in the simplest economics. Of course, there are all those other interesting effects having to do with who your peers and social norms, what the physical environment is that may be important as well. So who lived in low-income public housing and high-poverty areas who are affected by this program? Basically, it's almost entirely single female-headed households. 87% of these families were single female-headed households. The vast majority of them, had also, were not divorced. They were never married women. At the time, the mid-1990s, this was right when welfare reform was going in. Only about a quarter of them worked in the labor market. The vast majority were on welfare, AFDC/TANF. That goes down dramatically as welfare reform happens in the U.S. in the late 1990s. Almost 2/3 of the sample are black. In Baltimore and Chicago, it's essentially where were high poverty public housing. They were basically 100% black. LA and New York are pretty much 50-50 black and Hispanic. Boston is about 40% black, 40% Hispanic, 10% poor white living in South Boston units that actually qualified, and 10% Asian immigrant groups largely. There's enough sample size to separate out blacks and Hispanics, and for the most part, the effects look very similar. You can't break out whites and Asians separately, and there's not enough sample to look at married couples versus single female-headed households, given the domination by single female-headed households. Why did these people say they wanted to sign up for the program? Overwhelmingly, the reasons they wanted to move, these were very high crime, dangerous areas. They noted were fear of crime, safety concerns, particular concerns that their kids were going to get involved with gangs and be injured. Those were the overwhelming reasons. Again, who were they? The typical woman here was about 33 at baseline. So when we look at them 15 years later, they're sort of in their mid-40s by the long-term outcome. Kids are of all ages that we're going to follow. As we can see, the heads are largely female, African American, a substantial number of Hispanics, the vast majority never married, a very low fraction employed at baseline, less than 40% of them had high school degrees. The vast majority were on welfare at baseline. They lived in very poor housing. They believed their housing conditions were quite poor. And what are their neighborhoods? Amazingly, over 50% of their neighbors in their census tract at baseline were living in poverty. So these are, 40% was the threshold, so it had to be over 40, but these are incredibly poor areas. These are sort of the poorest areas of the U.S. Yeah.
Quick question. How different is the people that apply to this? So both control and experimental group applied. So to the people that did not apply?
Okay, so the people who didn't apply who were living in these same units were eligible. So we don't have all the details because we don't have a survey. We have administrative data. So in terms of ages, they don't look very different than the people who didn't. And race and ethnicity, they don't look very different. They tended to be a little shorter term, having lived in this public housing unit than those. So they were in qualitative evidence, they were people who were less connected to their public housing units. They self-report fewer relatives living there. In terms of the observables, we can see they are sort of somewhat shorter term in public housing than the people there. And the way my own qualitative, which I know Boston a lot better, I view them as the sort of third of public housing people who wanted to move, who didn't have many relatives there, and were sufficiently clued in that they actually could figure out how. There were some people who would be happy to move but didn't have their act together to show up to these things, and there were some people who were actually pretty content in their public housing. One of the interesting things, if you look at the reasons they wanted to move, as you can see in it, hugely it's get away from drugs and gangs was the number one reason they said they wanted to move. Many of them, because there was a huge drop in crime going on in the inner cities of all these areas over the next sort of 5-7 years, many of the families we've done qualitative interviews said, I would never have signed up for the program if I knew, things were going to get so much safer, over the next 5 years. But in fact, I'm incredibly glad that I did, because, I never would have moved to a place like this. But they were greatly, they were large. Boston had a huge wave of youth murders going on at this time, so there was a lot of fear in the environments. The crack wave had been a number of years before, so these were very dangerous neighborhoods, over 50% poor, very residentially, minority segregated, low share of highly educated people. Over 40% of them reported some serious criminal victimization of a household member in the 6 months before the baseline survey, so crime was very salient. The majority felt the streets were unsafe. They were very dissatisfied with their neighborhoods. There's a reasonable amount of past literature that has tried to look at housing mobility studies quasi-experimentally. One of the big motivations for moving to opportunity was an earlier study known as the Gautreaux study, done by the best work on this by a sociologist at Northwestern, James Rosenbaum. What was Gautreaux? Gautreaux happened in Chicago. It had very much a similar group, people living in public housing in Chicago, African American. It came out of a housing anti-discrimination suit that found the Public Housing Authority of Chicago, under the previous Mayor Daley, was clearly racially discriminating. The fact that it was 100% African American and there were a bunch of other units that were 100% white was pretty prima facie evidence of that. So the resolution of that lawsuit was that a nonprofit was set up that became Gautreaux that had vouchers, and it tried to move people on a long waiting list into housing units with vouchers in less segregated areas. So it was based on racial rather than economic segregation. And the work Rosenbaum did is he sort of looked at people who got to move to sort of suburban areas versus people who moved to other parts of the inner city. So he looked at people who moved somewhat richer, farther away areas and found that there were huge apparent positive impacts on the kids' outcomes, going to college, finding a job, and a modest but pretty substantial employment outcomes for the mothers. The difficulty with the Rosenbaum analysis, which was clearly the best done at the time, was that there was always a worry of two forms of issues. One was attrition. He only found about 40-50% of the people they were trying to look for, and you were much more likely to be found if you were living at the address you had been originally assigned to. So if you'd done well in the suburbs, you were more likely to be found than if you didn't. And the second is that it was all the original assignments had been lost at Gautreaux. So the extent to which people who were willing to move to the suburbs versus different areas would be unobservable different types was very hard to assess. So but it greatly motivated HUD to want to do a more serious experimental evaluation to see if this very promising desegregation policy really was something that would stand up to scrutiny. There were two other important quasi-random studies. Brian Jacob used the differential timing of demolishing public housing units in Chicago to look at kids' test scores and found very little impact. And Phil Oriopoulos looked at the sort of quasi-experimental, which public housing unit you got into in Toronto in very different areas, and found very little impact on economic and educational outcomes. So quite contrasting with the Gautreaux. This motivated moving to opportunity, and we have been working on this for a long time. Our early work found quite positive impacts on health and mental health 1 year out, and not much on economic outcomes. At 4 to 7 years out, our interim evaluation, again, continued to find positive impacts on mental health, physical health, very little on economic self-sufficiency, very positive effects for girls, not much going on for boys, if anything, negative effects. And that's where I'm going to go to today, look at the long-run outcomes. Our interim findings has had a lot of interesting reactions. Sociologists, in many cases, there's huge heterogeneity, so I shouldn't, characterize. I would say this is a typical of some group have argued that this is a very important study, but it shouldn't be viewed as the be-all and end-all, quite reasonably, of neighborhood effects. Their argument, and I think that's probably a bit overstated on the part, is this is a weak treatment. So if your view of a neighborhood effect is what would happen if you took a family living in the Cabrini Green, Robert Taylor homes, and you moved them, to Lincoln Park in the, upper middle class, neighborhood with a lot of, high-level managers, and got them into the best school in that area, and had them live there for 15 years, what would it do? We definitely don't have much of an experiment of that type. If you said in Boston, if you moved to Wellesley from Roxbury and stayed there for 15 years, what would it do? That not a lot of families with a Section 8 voucher can move to Wellesley or move to Lincoln Park. If you're asking what happens if you get an opportunity to move out of the worst public housing to what feasibly you could do in the range, I think, of policies, move to Somerville, move maybe even to Medford, there were some families, different parts, and are very different environments, move to Roxbury to West Roxbury. I think this is within the range of feasible policies. Hard to imagine something in current budgets that would be larger. I think there is a real treatment. I think I'll show that to you. Economists sort of just looked at the economic self-sufficiency outcomes and said neighborhoods don't matter. All this stuff about health and mental health, well, that's mush, who cares about it? We sort of think that there probably is a more nuanced story, that these are very strong evidence neighborhoods matter for things in health and mental health and for well-being, but not so much for economic self-sufficiency and for kids' outcomes. So if you want to eradicate poverty, this is not going to be the answer, and we will see this. If you want to make people in very distressed situations have much healthier, safer lives and have better well-being, reducing the concentration of poverty and of crime and of making the neighborhood safer would have huge social payoffs. By themselves, if you're still in really lousy schools and have very limited skills, it's not going to solve the inequality program, but it may have very important policy implications as a precursor to that, and that's what I think our findings will show. So I'll get into the details, but basically we're going to find at 1 year, 5 years, and 15 years out strong positive impacts of changing neighborhood environments to less distressed neighborhoods on mental health and physical health. And the physical health results will come, not from just self-reports, but actually from collecting people's blood, pricking their fingers and actually measuring untreated diabetes, putting them on scales and looking at obesity. So we think they are pretty accurate, measuring C-reactive protein. So I think we have very serious health measures that would pass most measures. We have good data on economic outcomes, very, very little impact on that's really what I need, sorry. Okay. Yes, very little impact on economic outcome and very little impact on kids, long-run outcomes. And as we will see, some improvements in girls' mental health and keeps you out of drug gangs. Definitely being away from the drug gangs does matter. So I would call this, while the name of the program was Moving to Opportunity, thinking about economic opportunity, I would call it more probably Moving to Tranquility. What really matters is safety, and reducing economic segregation has huge impacts on well-being, but by itself, being closer to jobs without having a lot of connections and skills for them, still being in pretty poor schools isn't going to change the economic outcomes very much. So how did we do this? We basically went back to the field between June 2008 and April 2010, and we went after all the household heads in the experimental and in the control group, and 2/3 of those in the Section 8 group. Why 2/3? That's just funding constraints. We went after all the kids 10 to 20 years old and we collected information administratively on the grown children who had been sort of teens at baseline and from their parents. We did not have the resources to track all the adult kids down. We got basically a very big part of any randomized experiment to do long-term outcome is you've got to track the people and got to get a very high response rate. If you don't get a very high response rate, effectively you've destroyed the experiment, the extent you have a lot of non-random attrition. So we have two ways of dealing with that. One, we use administrative data with passive tracking, where we can basically get the universe up to people making up their social security numbers. And two, we spent a lot of time tracking, and then we used a two-stage sampling technique where once we got 75%, which is a very high response rate in this ball game, we then randomly picked 35% of the remaining ones and put a lot of resources to tracking them down and found over half of those, and then we reweighed up the people in that random group, and that gives us essentially an over 90% effective response rate. So we don't think, we think this is really pretty clean at getting what the answers are. And as we collected a lot of administrative data, and you might think administrative data really is the be-all and end-all to answers, but the US, if we were doing this in Sweden, that would be true. The US, the administrative data varies by state. Some states will allow you individual level data. Some states won't because of their rules. They're inconsistent the way they track things. So while it's at some level, it's the universe. At other levels, we don't have a great database. National Student Clearinghouse for tracking down colleges misses a lot of colleges that poor people go to. So in the end of the day, it's not even, I think for knowing whether you're getting HUD assistance, even HUD didn't have computerized database at the start of our sample. They do today. Most of these public housing projects. So in the end, especially for things like health and mental health, there's no substitute for the survey data. For economic outcomes, I think, the administrative data is pretty good, but even there, we're missing a lot of off-the-books work. So as I noted, what we're going to look at is compare the means of the experimental groups and the control groups, and that'll give us a basic impact of opportunity move, and then basically you can inflate that up to see what's the impact of actually using it. And as we noted, about half the people in the experimental group, 60% in Section 8, leased up. It varied across sites. It was much easier to move in LA than it was in Boston or New York, which had much tighter housing markets at that time. And if you want to think of, this is in Chicago, the sort of after from the before picture we showed, don't think of moving to large suburban, tract, dwellings in Wellesley or high-rise, rich people condominiums. Think of, working, middle-class neighborhoods that are pretty safe and have stores, but they're not, large, dwelling.
I seem to recall that there was some negative response from percentile recipient neighborhoods, I guess.
It's
in Baltimore. Can you
in
tell us a bit
Baltimore.
about that?
Yeah, so they're actually very interesting. So in Baltimore, simultaneous to moving to Opportunity, which literally was only 900 households in Baltimore, they started the Hope 6 demolishments, and some talk radio guy, right-wing talk radio guy, got confused and started a campaign against moving to Opportunity because first of all, thinking that all these, poor people were going to move to, these middle-class neighborhoods, getting it confused with the larger demolishments, which were sort of a 10-year process. And in the end, nothing came of that. What it did do, Barbara Mikulski was a senator from Maryland who had been very positive in this program, sort of backed off any future funding of other experiments like this type, but it didn't really affect this program itself. The truth is, the being riled up were none of the actual receiving neighborhoods because they weren't areas with under 10% poverty rates. But I don't think it greatly affected. It was a short-run sort of publicity blitz, but it probably made it much more difficult for anyone to go back and get more funding for these types of programs in the future because of her constituent responses. So, is there an experiment in where people lived? The answer is yes. If you look 4 to 7 years out, The typical experimental group family lived in an area with about 9% lower poverty, and because about half of them moved, that means about, cut in half the poverty rate of the typical area you were living at. You will notice the control group started at 53%. Even if you weren't in this program, you're in a much lower poverty area on average, 4 years out, and much greater 10 to 15. Two things happened about that. Most of the people in the control group move over time, some on their own, some get vouchers when their places were demolished. And in general, the concentration of poverty in some of these cities fell in the boom of the 1990s. So even if you stayed in the same place, it was lower poverty area in 2000 than it had been in 1994, for example, although it's back up high poverty in 2008. And if you put together the 15 years, the cumulative response, it's about 9% for the experimental, 7% for the Section 8. And so if you actually moved, it's about cutting in half the average poverty rate of your area over, 15 years and cutting it by, a third. If you think of that in the distribution of U.S. census tracts, the ITT here over 15 years is about a change of almost 1 standard deviation improvement in where you are in the median family income or the poverty rate of your neighborhood, and almost 2 standard deviations, is the tote if you're the experimental group. You're basically moving from the 5% of poorest neighborhoods to start to at 1 year out, you're literally sort of in the median census tract in the U.S. income distribution, and you're sort of in the 40th percentile if you were a mover in the experimental group. So you're moving from the bottom 5% to the 40th percentile, but the control group's improving, and they're moving up to sort of the 10th, 15th percentile over time, but there's still very large differences. This gives you a bit more detail. Year 1 out, they, literally, you were in sort of 10 to 15% poverty areas. I think the best way to see what's going on is let's look at the people we call compliers, the people who moved in the experimental group. This is the distribution over the next 15 years on average of where they lived, and that is who they would have been if they had been in the control. This is what's called control compliers. We can see the people in the experimental group who didn't move, and under the assumption that being offered a voucher and not using it doesn't affect your outcome, we can basically say that everyone who wouldn't have moved in the control group will have that same outcome. So we can subtract off from the entire density of outcomes of control group the people who, wouldn't have used their voucher. And in fact, it doesn't make much difference if I'd shown you the overall control group. And the basic point is the typical experimental family is sort of living in a 10 to 15% poverty area, not that different than the U.S. national average. Today, the poverty rate's about 15%. Essentially, nobody in the control group ends up living in those types of neighborhoods persistently. They end up living much better than they started. Remember, they're starting in 50%, so they're living in 30% poverty areas, which are still way up in the poverty distribution, much better than where they started. But there's very little concentration in this, where the typical experimental group family lives. And the other thing is no one in the experimental group moved back after year 1 to the neighborhoods they started out from and then, sort of got a 50% average poverty rate. So they do move after year 1. The way the experimental voucher worked is you had to stay in your initial location for a year, and then it was a flexible Section 8 voucher. But they basically move to very different areas than where the control group, gets an opportunity to move to. And if you do Section 8, you basically find very much a substantial improvement, but you're not getting people into the very low poverty areas that the experimental. They're sort of earlier moving to places in the sort of 20% poverty rate range where the control people don't quite get as good. So it's a substantial treatment, but it's not getting the extreme differences. If you look across sites, there's a fair amount of variation. In LA, a much larger share of the group families were able to move. They moved much larger distances to better neighborhoods. A much smaller share moved in Chicago, and they didn't make as large change. So we're going to actually try to use some of that cross-site variation to try to get a little bit inside the black box of where the dosage was larger. So there is an experiment, and it shows up in housing and neighborhood quality. 5 years out, 15 years out, people subjectively feel safer. If we send our surveyors out to look at their neighborhoods, there's less graffiti, there are less cockroaches in the houses, paint isn't falling off the walls, they are much more satisfied with their neighborhoods. So we have a large improvement in neighborhood quality. It narrows over time, not because the neighborhoods of the experimental in Section 8 get worse, but because the control group gravitates to better neighborhoods over time. It's a much larger change in economic segregation than in racial segregation. There's still, in a vast majority, minority neighborhoods. The target was changing the economics, so they moved to middle-class black neighborhoods if they were African American, not to very integrated neighborhoods. Large change in median family income. And the other key point for thinking about kids' results is it's a much smaller change in schools than it is in neighborhoods. So basically, the schools of the control group are in the bottom fifth of schools in their states, 18th percentile on average as they've moved. For the experimental group, it's only 22nd percentile, and even if you do the tote, you're still at the 25th percentile school. So they're still in the bottom quarter of schools in some really lousy, urban area school districts. And they're still in schools where the vast majority of students are poor, even though their neighborhoods, the vast majority of kids are not poor. Why is that? Well, you need to look at a map and you need to use a little bit of logic. And basically, what happens when you give someone a Section 8 voucher and tell them, for example, they need to move to an under 10% census tract? Not surprisingly, where can they afford with that voucher to do it? It's usually right on the edge of such a census tract, neighboring sort of a 15 to 20% census tract, and usually the reason there's a vacancy and you could get it at a Section 8 voucher price is because it's not connected to the better school, it's connected to the worst school attendance zone. It's still better than where you started, but the school change is much smaller than is the neighborhood change. And housing, it was much better at interim, continues to be better in terms of, housing conditions. There's very little difference in the share that are receiving housing assistance. Still, the vast majority of these people are getting housing assistance. And the other key thing, if you remember those indifference curves, they're getting better housing, safer neighborhoods, and they're not spending any more out of pocket for housing. So basically, in terms of the simple economics, you're getting a better neighborhood and housing bundle, self-reported as well as objective things like crime rates, and better housing objectively reported by people observing it, and you're not spending any more money. So on that thing, we think it should improve your well-being. What did it actually do? And this is the summary. Continued persistent improvements in health outcomes, mental and physical health for the adults. Nothing going on in terms of economic outcomes. Very quickly, we did a lot to try to do serious measurement of health. We worked with Ron Kessler and using the best sort of survey measures of trying to get at diagnosing depression, anxiety, psychological distress. This is the one thing I would never have thought of. We had a bunch of questions on trying to measure post-traumatic stress disorder, which the mental health people think is very important. I would never, maybe the inner city is like a war zone. We certainly didn't find any treatment effects on that, although we do on the other mental health outcomes. We actually physically measured individuals. We weighed them. We took blood pressure, and we used dried blood spots, which allowed us to measure glycated glucose, HbA1c, and C-reactive protein. This is an indicator of diabetes, and this is a potential indicator of heart disease and of stress and inflammation. What do we find? We found at interim and in the short run substantial improvements in mental health, and that continues to be true. These are very severely the control group. 20% of the women would be viewed as clinically depressed, and that's reduced by 3 to 5 percentage points as ITTs, or about 6 to 8 percentage points, or something like 30 to 40% reduction in depression, about 1/10 to 2/10, of a standard deviation reduction in psychological distress, overall improvements in mental health. These impacts on depression and psychological distress would sort of be, about equivalent to most of your favorite antidepressants and drug trials. So community environment seemed as important in terms of treatments for mental health illnesses as the types of things that are actually clinically approved drugs. Yeah, Mike.
So there's a lot of discussion of food deserts in the city.
We're going to get there in a second. So this is mental health. And this just goes to show you, generally we tend to find, if you look across the 5 sites, turn this into 15 points. So we're deviating from the site mean, how much on average you change the poverty of your census tract. You could do this for median income. You can see in LA, there's a much bigger experiment, the gap between experimental and control, than say there is, in New York City between these two. And what you find is pretty much the larger the dosage, the bigger the change in neighborhood environment, the bigger the improvement in mental health. And this generally is what we find in almost all the areas where we find improvements. If you really wanted to push and say, is there any clear nonlinearity? Nothing jumped out at you with 15 data points. We can turn this into 30 because it turns out there's a quirk of public housing and Section 8 housing that if your kids are of different gender, you get more money, and so you can move to better housing. So if you have 2 kids and one's a boy and one's a girl, you can get an extra bedroom, so you're given more money and have better choice. So you can use the gender composition of kids and essentially create 30 points of different opportunities to move. And you find very, almost in general, pretty linear. The bigger the change in neighborhoods on measures of poverty, median income, sort of linearly, the bigger the improvements. No evidence of clear threshold effects if you only get out of the very poorest or if you only get in the lowest poverty. It looks pretty much like a continuous, fairly monotonic function. Same thing here for an overall measure of absence of mental health. And now, food deserts. What does this do to obesity? At interim, we found substantial impacts on being obese with a BMI over 30 and on BMI linearly. At the long term, we find substantial impacts on extreme obesity, and if you'd done BMI linearly, it would be very large and significant. All of that is driven by the upper third of extreme obesity. As you can see, obese class 1, BMI greater than 30, there is a treatment effect, but it's not quite significant. But what's very consistent between the interim and the long term is basically as these women have aged, they're now in their mid-40s, they have become more and more obese on average, unfortunately. The most amazing fact is that 58% of the control group women are essentially, technically in the clinically obese over 30 BMI category. 35% are what are known as extreme obese, and 18% are, that is very clinically serious. And in the extreme categories, very large reductions, associated with this, and overall BMI a substantial increase. And these categories are very much related to onset of diabetes and a number of conditions. This type of obesity is a very large share of total healthcare spending. And basically, we're finding through the blood measures substantial reductions in untreated diabetes going on, and similar things show up on self-reports. This is viewed as more objective information, a little larger for the Section 8 on self-reports. What is the mechanism behind this? Is this food deserts? There's sort of several things. If you ask about exercise and diet, they go in the direction of if you're in a safer area, you do more physical exercise, you do self-report a bit more eating of fresh foods and vegetables, but we have a very difficult time sorting out, is it you're less depressed, so you exercise more and you eat better because you pay attention? Is it that your neighbors now have different habits, or is it literally that the relative price? So some of the follow-up work will be trying to look at things. I have a student who's got the scanner data so we can learn the prices of groceries and fresh fruits in all these different neighborhoods. But for now, there's sort of circumstantial evidence, but the clear evidence is changes in neighborhood environments seem to have significant impacts on obesity and on obesity-related disorders. The self-reported health thing, you found it at short term. I think people do a lot of adjustment of whether they say their health is fair or poor. There's not much impact going on here, but they're reporting fewer physical limitations. They're reporting they're happier, and when we look at the physical evidence, this is their self-report of physical limitations. If you look at their BMI, you look at their HbA1c, and if you look at this, which is an important precursor to heart disease and long-term conditions, there are also substantial effects for the experimental group in C-reactive protein. Yeah.
You may have mentioned this before, but how do you control for the fact that they're 15 years older now?
The control group's also 15 years older. So doing the comparison of the treatment and control, that's absolutely neutral. So they got worse over time in terms of health. Clearly, we have no idea but the comparison of, everyone aged 15 years over this 15 years, and they started out with the same age distribution. And so this also goes to show you the dosage of sort of, improvement in neighborhoods. Yeah.
So speaking of that aging issue, was there any substantial effect of people, at least in the control, like passing away because of their health outcomes are so bad that you're...
The mortality rate for this group is much higher than national sample. In one site in particular in Baltimore, the mortality rate was unbelievably high. I believe almost 5% of the adult women had passed away by the long-term evaluation. The other sites were much lower. Even with mortality rates of a couple percent, we didn't have the power to detect any treatment effects on mortality. So if you really stare at the data, there's a tiny bit lower in the treatment groups than the control, but we can't detect 1% estimates with any precision. Going from 2 to 1% wouldn't be technically something we could identify. 15 years from now, we might be able to identify mortality effects. Luckily, there isn't enough mortality in this group to be able to learn much about that. What about economic self-sufficiency? We have, both self-reports and administrative data, and I think basically this graph says it all. Every single one of those numbers, the standard error, this is plotting with administrative data for 15 years, for 11 years after random assignment, where we have consistent data across the 5 sites. You can't tell which groups control Section 8 or experimental. They're bopping around. Nothing is going on in terms of economic outcomes. If you took any one of those points, you couldn't reject that the experimental group's sort of 3-4% higher employment, has a little bit higher earnings, but, and any one of them. But, seeing lines like that over 15 years, it really doesn't look like much is going on in changing economic opportunities. Was there? Yeah. Yeah, we have a bunch of questions that I'm not going to show results on sort of credit, banks using of check cashing. And, again, if you squint at the data, they are a little more likely to have credit cards if they're in the treatment group. They're a little less likely to have things, medical debts, but whether that's because they're in better health or because they're in areas, other opportunity, they don't very much differ on it. In terms of, formal bank accounts, there's a slight positive treatment effect, but for the most part, there's not a lot detectable in terms of, those things, from being in the different neighborhoods. We have a bunch of stuff on, use of social services, and they aren't very different across the groups. So asset building, there's certainly nothing going on that we can detect. And, this gives you, but, pretty much every economic outcome, there's very little, going on throughout the sort of 15 years. So in terms of adults, substantial improvements in mental and physical health, of the type that have large economic value for people who value things like, activities of daily living, reducing the sort of diabetes rates and depression rates by this amount would be, quite substantial economic benefit. It's, you could tell a story about, so you go, we've improved their mental health, their physical health. Well, why doesn't that translate into higher earnings? We know there's a relationship between mental health and physical health and earnings. Well, again, if you actually work through, so we improve mental health by, a tenth in an ITT or 2/10 in a tote of a standard deviation, take your best cross-section estimate of the impact of some mental health index on earnings, that might be a 1 or 2% effect on earnings. We certainly can't detect, we couldn't rule out, if you took those mechanisms and threw them into earnings, they just aren't big enough to have been detectable effects, even though they're very substantial things in terms of well-being of individuals. For the youth, in the short run, we were finding some positive effects on, measures of health and a little bit on schooling. At interim, the positive things remained for girls and not for boys. In the long run, everything is sort of mushed. The boys, are doing, about the same in the treatment and controls. The girls are doing slightly better, but, sort of none of it's really statistically significant. Overall, the things that really seem to, nothing is going on in school achievement, nothing in physical health. We continue to have the girls. The girls are safer environments. They're getting less, things such as domestic violence and sexual relations. It shows up in persistent improvements in mental health of the girls. And the boys are staying out of drug gangs, but they're still doing a lot of petty crimes. Michael. We did. That's so noisy in this data, you just can't. I mean, you would have to have massive changes. That's something where we just don't have any power to detect anything. Yeah.
Is there any reason to believe that this sample would react differently to moving toxin than something like the top 10% or so? Because I understand the importance of answering how does this affect people in the most distressed circumstances, but what if they were less distressed than the event?
Right. So I have two answers to the question. Certainly, this isn't telling me anything about giving someone in one middle class neighborhood the ability to move to a rich neighborhood. I don't think we have learned much. I think it's a little, the fact that we have 5 sites, there is a fair amount, Boston, the distressed neighborhoods were more like the 20th percentile of the national distribution. In Chicago, they're the bottom 1%. So the cross-site variation does give us a little bit of ability to answer for a broader, group than just the very, very most distressed. So I think, but this is an experiment about, I think, a very important group. Say the bottom 5th of families in terms of their economic situation in the U.S. The people, a group of poor, inner city families. I think it has a fair amount of external validity for that. It wouldn't be a good group for thinking about, overall neighborhood effects for middle class families, what would they would matter. I think that's a very different world. So we're answering the question. I think, this is the best evidence we have on people living in distressed environments. What does removing some of those stressors do to their outcomes? So basically on kids, I won't, we can go through the numbers, but that will give you the basic story. Where I want to finish up is letting the families sort of speak for themselves. I pushed and was able to get at least one, we have a bunch of mental health questions, so I think that helps answer this. One standard general well-being, happiness question. I would have had 5 or 6 to do what currently is state of the art, but our sponsors didn't feel that was that important a thing to do. I understand being an economist why you want all the objective data, but I actually think this is a reasonable summary measure of letting the families themselves speak for it. So this is the standard happiness question of the general social survey, which there's a lot of evidence that it's clearly related to measures, more objective measures of well-being. So basically, we are finding, treatment effects on being very happy or pretty happy. If you turn this into sort of an ordered measure or a z-score, something in the range of 1/10 of a standard deviation intent to treat and 2/10 of a standard deviation, sort of tote. If you look at the relationship between income and happiness, this is about, like a $13,000, increase in income. Given these families have incomes in the 20,000, that's nothing to sneeze at. That's pretty big economically in terms of improving happiness. It's almost the size of the black-white happiness gap in the United States. So in terms of their subjective well-being, I think, and this sort of gives you little graphs of, psychological distress and the happiness look very similar. And so if you put this all sort of together, substantial improvements in happiness, and mental well-being, put the two treatment groups, nothing going on in economic self-sufficiency. If we're looking at the mechanisms, just to conclude, if you look at the relationship, conditioning on that, we have enough variation across the sites that we can ask racial versus sort of economic segregation, what really seems to matter in changing. And it's really the economic segregation which seems to be driving the improvements in mental health, physical health, and in well-being measures. And if anything, the changes in racial segregation by themselves go in the wrong direction. The families that improve the most are the sites where you got to much better off areas in terms of financially, but that were still substantially minority. So being in a thriving black middle class neighborhood actually was the most beneficial type of treatment going on in this, not moving into much more, how that generalizes we don't know, but it's economic segregation. In terms of thinking about what's happened in the US in recent decades, we've had growing economic segregation, and so that suggests policies with housing mobility that offset that may not by themselves solve the poverty problem, but may be very beneficial in terms of family well-being and may have large social benefits in terms of healthcare costs. And so as I would conclude, neighborhoods are tremendously important for people's well-being. It really shows up in health and mental health. By themselves, it doesn't seem, in the range at which we can change the neighborhood environments and economic opportunity to be that important for economic outcomes. There's still large standard errors. We couldn't rule out modest improvements in economic well-being, but this doesn't look like by itself, if you're still have very poor set of skills and you're in areas with lots of unemployment, even in middle class neighborhoods, it's not a panacea for your economic outcomes. And while the kids are safer and healthier in some measures and staying out of the worst type of trouble, it's not showing up on achievement tests or in later economic outcomes at this stage. So if you were saying, how do you, end poverty and intergenerational poverty, changing neighborhood environments in this range by itself doesn't do it. But, would this be socially an important thing to do for things we really care about, like people's well-being? I think the answer is, this is some of the best causal evidence that neighborhoods really do matter. And the mechanisms seem a lot to do with economic status of your neighbors and with measures of neighborhood safety, more than racial isolation by itself, at least, in this US setting. So I'm happy to take further questions on this. Sure.
So maybe I'm missing something, but is it right that in no case did you find a significant difference between the two voucher arms? And if that's the case, isn't this really a statement about just how awful these it's really the voucher versus having to stay another few years.
Yeah, so
demolished. So it's not neighborhoods in general.
Right.
And the identification that you're getting here, which is so dramatic and interesting, is still with the self-selection among those who got vouchers.
Right. So basically, if you ask, does getting in the experimental group, be statistically significantly different than being in the Section 8? Yeah, for most outcomes, you could cherry pick outcomes and find significant differences. But if you create, we did in order to prevent cherry picking, we created a number of indices, 5 years ago of sort of mental health outcomes, physical health outcomes. In all those cases, you can't reject that the traditional voucher and the experimental are the same, but they're picking up two different things. Because in the Section 8 thing, a larger fraction of families move, but they didn't move as much. And in the experimental, a smaller family. If you decompose it using graphs like this, I think what it tells you generally is that the bigger the dosage, the larger. So when the experimental has a large fraction of people moving, it does give you a much bigger effect because they move to much better neighborhoods. So the cross-site, cross-treatment group, and then when you add in sort of your opportunities to move, suggest it isn't, you can stick in a 0-1 dummy, you know, an instrument for it. You have enough of whether you just got out of public housing early or not. That's not what's driving it. It looks continuous in the quality of your neighborhood. So the gap between the experimental and the Section 8 isn't significant just because a lower fraction of people got the opportunity to move in the experimental. But it really does look like the bigger the improvement in neighborhood safety continuously, the bigger the improvement in the poverty rate of your neighborhood, the bigger the gains. So it isn't just 0-1. Just moving and staying in a really poor neighborhood doesn't do anything for you. So for the most part.
But that's not randomized, that's it.
No. So if we looked at individual moving, it isn't. So that here it's not randomized except to the extent, this is where you're doing a little. So the identification assumption here is we're going to ask if Los Angeles is different than Boston. Is it because in Los Angeles it was easier to move in a place that changed your life differently? So that's not truly experimental. Here we're adding some structure. We're basically saying the reason the treatment effect differs across the sites is the opportunities to move were different across the places. If I had 100 sites, I'd be very confident of that. With 5, maybe there's just something idiosyncratic about LA and Boston. So that's putting structure that the experiment itself doesn't impose. But I think it's pretty reasonable structure that controlling for other mediators does make. Yeah, Michael.
So, is it the case that for all of these places, between the time you started and the time you started asking the question, there's a disproportionately bigger increase in safety in very poor neighborhoods than the neighborhoods that the people move to? And if that's the case, then what you're finding sort of understates the effect because everybody would get better when you're comparing to
Right. So the treatment effect, sort of the ITT here, over the long haul is, basically picking up much smaller differences in neighborhoods than initial. So when we did 1 year out, in the initial survey, we're getting bigger effects on neighborhood satisfaction and on some of the mental health things. But even 15 years out, it's a little dicey in that we don't really know the production function. Say for mental health or, obesity, is it today's neighborhood or is it the accumulation over, your lifetime that matters? If you do it on the basis, so one reason to believe that these things have narrowed over time is that the differences in neighborhoods have become much smaller over time. So using this sort of variation, I can say, so if I take this literally, that this is an index of neighborhood quality, let's say the poverty rate of a median family, and I essentially instrument for the, your change in neighborhood poverty by what treatment group you were in and what site you were in, controlling for site dummies. I can then ask, what does a 1 standard deviation change in neighborhood poverty do, or 1 standard deviation change, in neighborhood safety due to your mental health, due to your happiness, due to your economic well-being, and, we have these numbers. We have a version of the paper that does that that's sitting at one of the science journals. And basically a 1 standard deviation sort of change in this group in sort of the poverty of neighborhoods is something like a 0.13 standard deviation change in the index of mental health or of happiness. So we think we can, using the fact that there's a fair amount of variation across sites, try to get at that more directly. But just looking at the little ITT that's left over doesn't give you the full story for how much the different neighborhoods matter.
But the neighborhoods, the green neighborhood, 95 is not like
Oh yeah, and well, obviously no one's living in Cabrini Green today because it's been demolished. So, yeah. So no, we do not have the experiment of what if what would have happened if we kept the control families in neighborhoods like 1995 Robert Taylor homes for 15 years. We can extrapolate that, if you're willing to believe something like this, that if they had stayed in there, it would be like changing the relative poverty by 2 standard deviations, let's say, as opposed to the 0.6 on average that we changed it. And so if you believe this linear relationship, which is really pushing sort of 30 data points, that would be sort of like we would have seen an improvement rather than 0.1 in psychological distress of 0.25 standard deviations. That's Oh, yeah, oh, yeah, if we'd had much larger changes, then we would have, if 0.25 with the same standard error, of course, would be much more significant. Yeah, some things that are not detectable. So say we're seeing, the economic outcomes, are 2% better. If they really had been 3 times bigger, 6%, we would have been able to detect them. So yeah, this is one of the critiques of sociologists. If you wanted to say what it's like to live in the Robert Taylor homes for 15 years versus to live, on the edge of Evanston for 15 years, we don't have a lot of power to detect that. We are trying to extrapolate that from this type of thing. If you want to ask what it's like to have been given the opportunity to move and help versus what happened to a family who 8 years later was forced to move without any help, that's directly what the ITT answers. Yeah.
Just a couple of quick observations. I don't want people to be left with the impression that all public housing and all subsidized housing are as bad as Cabrini Green.
Oh no, this is the very worst of the worst.
Some people, because
Yeah.
some students might not be aware that you're looking at some of the very worst public housing and so bad that some of it was developed.
Oh yeah.
Indeed, even in your study, it looked like, more than half of the sample didn't even say that the neighborhoods were very bad, and that even a quarter, I think, one of your slides showed that even a quarter of the people thought that their housing was very good.
Oh,
Or
yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
So, and then just another quick comment. The study that we would like to see, which is looking at the Wellesley or Evanston's and the impacts of households moving to those neighborhoods, we can't do because in part, there's no housing stock in
Oh,
those
yeah,
areas
right.
because of exclusionary practices
Yes.
and so forth, and no housing stock that people can move to. So my question is, did you disaggregate your data in such a way so that you looked at the people who moved to the very best neighborhoods in terms of the lowest impacts of poverty to see whether there was any economic impact?
Unfortunately, that's not a reasonable thing to do because there's huge selection. So the problem, of course, is the type of family. Say there was one family that moved to Wellesley. That family is clearly not random. It's a very different type, and we have no way of disentangling, whether the reason they did very well is because they moved to Wellesley or they would have done great otherwise. That you're throwing away the experiment to do that. So what we did is this type of thing. We're saying that on average in LA, you had much more opportunity to move to very different neighborhoods. It's sort of which treatment group you are and which site, we're sort of using that to extrapolate. What I believe the wrong thing to do, if you want to see that paper, there is a paper, Doug Massey, who is a very distinguished sociologist, who I have great respect for, has a lead article in the American Journal of Sociology in 2008 with Susan Clampett-Lundquist, where they do exactly what you say. Take the subsample of people, define getting into a good neighborhood as saying you spent X years in a neighborhood that they defined it a low enough share minority and a low enough poverty rate, and stayed there. And if you look at that group, the answer is yes, they do better on economic outcomes. My concern with that is I don't know whether they did better in economic. That the whole reason we ran this experiment is because we know when we look in a cross-section, people who look poor end up in those neighborhoods do better, but is that because of the selection or that because of the neighborhood? What we can do, if you just wanted to make that the treatment, say the treatment is there's no effect unless you move to which I think is not reasonable because it looks very continuous. If all this is coming through getting to a really low poverty, low minority neighborhood, you can use the same sorts of variation and just multiply the coefficients, by the ratio of people who got that. You'll get a much larger estimate of everything, but it'll be much noisier because we just don't have enough information because there are just so few families to do that. And just looking at those families themselves, gives, you don't need MTO to do that. You can just go, use any standard national data set and find that people who live in those neighborhoods do better, but I think that, unfortunately we can't answer that. We could have had a treatment that said you had to move to an area, and stay for 15 years. That we felt that was utterly infeasible.
I propose that we continue the discussion in a better neighborhood, the one with although that might increase obesity, I don't know.
Okay.
And so again, thank you very much to Professor Katz for